one of the primary issues that Paul is trying to address in Romans is this relationship between Jewish Christians, Gentile Christians, and then also Jewish people who are not believers in Jesus, who seem to have suddenly become enemies of the church, maybe increasingly so by this point. So I am persuaded that that's a huge issue for Paul. Most of what he has to talk about has to do with navigating that and trying to understand it theologically. I also am in agreement that Romans 9 is essentially Paul's attempt to make sense of what he said in chapters 1 through 8 with the specific problem of the hardening of Israel, and trying to figure out how that makes sense given all that he's been trying to lay out in the gospel. Well, it's Romans, but it's a summary of the gospel. That's all straightforward for me. As I get into verse 6 of Romans 9, and Paul begins to make this argument that not all who are of Israel are Israel, and he begins to lay down this idea that true Israel are the people of promise. Where I might be somewhat unique is the question of what God's purpose in election is, because that's where the passage gets interesting for me. Well, I'll read it just for the sake of reading it, but this is chapter 9, verse 10. Nor is that all. Something similar happened to Rebekah when she conceived children by one husband, our ancestor Isaac, even before they had been born or had done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose of election might continue, not by works, but by his call. She was told the elder shall serve the younger. So that question for me guides a lot of my reading of Romans 9. What is God's purpose in election? Salvation is not exactly in view here, that it's something else. Maybe it is in view tangentially, but the primary purpose of God's election remains for me. And to try and discern what that is, I just sort of let the text tell me who's in play. Obviously, we've had Abraham already mentioned, Isaac already mentioned, Jacob already mentioned, Moses perhaps, but the strange insertion is Pharaoh. And it seems to me that all of these are meant by Paul to be examples of people who are chosen, and all chosen for the same purpose, it seems to me. It seems that whether we're talking about Abraham, we're talking about Isaac, we're talking about Jacob, we're talking about Pharaoh, these are all people chosen to proclaim who God is to the world. And Pharaoh serves that purpose as well as Abraham does. But Pharaoh accomplishes that purpose by a different means. His heart is hardened. And through his hardness, God preaches a sermon to declare who he is. And I think that's what's at stake in verse 16 when it says, it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who shows mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I've raised you up for the very purpose of showing my power in you, so that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he chooses, and he hardens the heart of whomever he chooses. To me, it's not that he's doing this, it's why he's doing this. And it seems to me that he hardens Pharaoh's heart for the same reason he has mercy on Abraham, which is to make sure that his glory is declared in the earth, and that the earth has knowledge of what God is doing and what he wants for us. So I think of this as sort of an instrumental election, for lack of a better term. Maybe somebody can think of a better term. But he's electing for a purpose, and that purpose is the proclamation of a message that if God does not intervene directly, will be lost, or perhaps never discovered. It's for the purpose of revelation. At least that's the way that I read it. And I think that the next question, verse 19, you'll say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? And Paul suggests, who are you, a human being, to argue with God? It smacks quite a bit of Job and some other passages where we sort of have the audacity to ask questions we have no right to ask. But then Paul goes right on to address it anyway. So maybe he's telling us a little humility, folks, a little humility, and then we'll move in and address this. But I think the question that's being asked is, if Pharaoh's hardness was for God's purposes, then by what logic do we consider Pharaoh to be such a bad guy? I think that's sort of where it's headed. So he goes on to say, Job-like, will what is molded say to one who molds it, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one object for special use and another for ordinary use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and make known his power, has endured with much patience the objects of his wrath that are made for destruction? And what if he's done so in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy, which he's prepared beforehand for glory? To me, speaking of objects of wrath and objects of mercy, and this goes back to Romans 1 when Paul begins to bring Habakkuk into the conversation, which is the famous quotation at the beginning of the book, "The righteous will live by faith." That comes from Habakkuk 2:4. The issue that is at stake in Habakkuk, and I think plays itself out through the book of Romans because of the issues that we've discussed are behind it. The question for Habakkuk is, how can God use Babylon, this wicked and horrible nation, to bring judgment on Israel, who granted needs judgment, but is nowhere near Babylon? Why in the world would God use such a wicked and horrible people to bring judgment on his own people? Habakkuk thinks it's outside of God's character to do that. And the context in which God eventually says the righteous will live by faith, while Habakkuk says it, is in the context of that conversation. It's very similar to what we see, I think, in Romans 9, when we're talking about vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy. So in one way, Pharaoh is a vessel of wrath because he's done terrible things. I think we're talking about things that carry wrath, kind of like the bowls of wrath in the book of Revelation. I don't think we're necessarily talking about people who are prepared to have wrath spelled on them. Vessels of wrath are things that hold wrath. Vessels of mercy are things that hold mercy. In this way, we have two pictures. We have the picture of Abraham, who's a vessel of mercy. Through you, all nations on earth will be blessed. And in Pharaoh, we have a vessel of wrath who's more meting out punishment or some sort of vengeance or hurtfulness more than he is anything of positive. But both get used for the same end, which is to declare God's name. I think that's what he's struggling with, why God is willing to forbear, why he's willing to put up with these wicked vessels and then use them the way Babylon was used, the way Egypt was used. That's the way that I read it. And so he seems to indicate that both of these things are being used for the same purpose. They're being used to declare who God is. When I read this with a Calvinist and they're insistent that objects of wrath are individuals who God has determined to destroy, and objects of mercy as individuals who God has determined to show mercy to, I don't know how that fits with the larger argument of Romans, which is really about God's election and why he chooses different kinds of people, both to declare his glory, sometimes showing mercy, sometimes hardening hearts, but always for his glory. Why does he do this? That seems to me to be the purpose. And of course, that is an issue that is significant for Paul, because Israel now seems to be hardened. Like Pharaoh was. They seem to be suddenly objects of wrath because they are persecuting the church. So how do we make sense of this? Has Israel's election been forsaken? And it seems the answer that Paul will give in Romans 9-11 is no. Israel's election is the same. They were objects of mercy. Now they become objects of wrath, but both for the same purpose. So they are still being used by God to declare his glory. And if we proceed on to the remnant discussion in Romans chapter 10, the emphasis on there needs to be someone to bring the message and then someone needs to receive it, what we begin to realize, I believe in free will. I believe in graced free will, meaning that I don't believe that, I think the thing that distinguishes Pelagians from Arminians, from Wesleyans, is that Pelagians seem to think that free will is a consequence of nature, that we are created free. I think what distinguishes Wesleyans and Arminians truly from Pelagians is that we distinguish between nature and grace. We recognize that free will is something God graces us. It's not something we have by nature, which is why we need God to intervene. We can't just choose him on our own by virtue of how we're created. At least that's how I understand the distinction. Now, I believe in free will, but I want to be careful about it. Because if free will is always libertarian in every single circumstance, and God will never violate that free will or push against it or put us in a position where we couldn't choose otherwise, if he will never do that, then hypothetically, theoretically, the gospel could be lost in a generation. some generation could freely use their free will to fully forsake God, and the gospel would be lost. All the Bibles burned, all the knowledge lost, everybody deciding just to walk away. I don't believe that God will allow that. And I think that's the essence of election, and I think it's the essence of remnant theology. God will ensure that there are some who will not forsake the message. They will be forced to bear it. Now, that doesn't mean they believe it. Pharaoh didn't believe it, but he was forced to bear it. And I think he will choose folks instrumentally to bear his message. Some through mercy, some through hardening, but it will be preserved. And the reason that feels like he's taking freedom from those people, which I believe he actually is taking their freedom, but not for their salvation, but because God is ensuring that the mass of humanity will have freedom by curtailing the freedom of some to ensure the message lasts through time. So my sense of Pharaoh is that for Paul, Israel's hardening is not a rejection of Israel, because it's an extension of the very same call. And Paul holds out the hope that they will be softened in the future. And I think I hold out that hope as well. I believe that that is what will occur.